竜様。
いいリュージョンです。いいリュージョンです。いいリュ愛してます。
いつ見てもいいわ。
I've always had a soft spot for Yakuza 3. When I first played it, I felt like it had this charm that Zero, the Kiwamis, and Like a Dragon sort of lacked, and as a result, it's been one of my favorite games in the franchise for years. There are definitely some rough edges to the game, like some of the more infamous lines.
No. There's no change in the plan. Bye.
If you're looking for Daigo, Mine's taken him up to the roof.
Beautiful eyes.
Or the combat that's infamously been nicknamed Blockuza, but at this point I've forgotten so much about Yakuza 3 that all I can remember is enjoying it back in 2021. After playing the remake a couple months ago, I still preferred the original to Kiwami 3, which I'm not as negative about as most other people, but that's for another day. It's been a while since I've played Yakuza 3 though, so I'm looking forward to giving the game another run through and seeing if my positive opinion still holds up after playing almost everything else in the franchise. Oh, one last thing before I start the review proper. Like a Dragon Kenzan technically released before Yakuza 3, but there isn't a fan translation for it yet. Because I don't speak Japanese, it'd suck in just about every possible way to play and write a review on it, so I'm skipping Kenzan in this review series until there's a decent version of it available. Yakuza 3 has garnered a reputation for having the worst combat in the series, and for pretty good reason. Even if I think it's a little better than the first Yakuza's combat, the issues with it are much more easily noticeable. In the original Yakuza, there are a bunch of tiny things that add up to make it feel worse to play overall, but with Yakuza 3, yeah, it's the blocking. That's it. The whole issue with Yakuza 3's combat is that enemies block way too much. It's really hard to even find an opportunity to attack them, because if you do a block breaking move, the recovery frames for Kiryu to get back to neutral are so long that the enemy is going to be able to reblock without issue. This means your primary option is now grabs, and grabs are so much less cool than everything else, not to mention enemies are better at dodging, so you're apt to whiff grabs a lot of the time too. While it's a little easier to get into the flow of combat compared to Yakuza 1, the issues are so prevalent that it's going to become a slog real fucking fast. I want to look at a couple of early boss fights as examples, specifically Rikiya and Tamashiro. Rikiya is the less egregious of the two, so let's start there. When you start to fight him, you'll notice very quickly that there's not much you can do. Usually you're only going to get a couple of hits into the combo before he starts to block, and because Rikiya is able to dodge, it's very common to whiff grabs on him. After a while, you'll probably start to think, this fight's been going on for a while, there's no way he's not at least close to dead by now, and then you look down at his HP bar and what the fuck, it's a third of the way down. In my case, I had been fighting him for a solid 2.5 minutes before I got there, which in any other game would probably be enough for the whole fight to be over. What I'm trying to get at is that your attacks just don't do enough damage, and there's not a way around this. The way damage works is that you're rewarded for getting big hits off. Generally, the deeper into a combo string you go, the stronger a finisher will be, and the quicker the fight will be over. The blocking, though, makes it so incredibly screwy to get a combo off, so you have to rely on more roundabout ways of dealing damage. The nearby tables and chairs can be decent, and they do break Rikiya's block, but there's still the issue of him reblocking when Kiryu is in the recovery frames for the table attacks, so you can't properly punish the guard break. Grabs are a viable tool, but really boring, so it makes the fight a bit of a slog. Tamashiro is 10 times worse. I'm going to start out by enumerating every issue with this fight. Tamashiro constantly blocks. His first phase involves him using a knife, which disrupts Kiryu's combo and is unblockable. You only have 3 pieces of furniture to use against Tamashiro in this fight. Tamashiro has 2 HP bars, while Kiryu is barely any stronger than the Rikiya fight, who only had 1. Prior to the dungeon before this fight, Kamiyama the weapons dealer shows up to introduce the weapon system, implying that weapons could help against the boss fight, but it's a trick, because the staff he gives you hits like a wet noodle. Because Tamashiro uses a weapon, Kiryu's own weapons can't break his guard as effectively. In his second phase, Tamashiro gets Brass Knuckles into Heat Aura, which means he's going to be able to super armor through Kiryu's attacks. In the second phase, Tamashiro will break out of grabs because of the aforementioned Heat Aura. It's like a perfect storm of dog shit that comes together to make one of the most infuriating fights in the series. There's absolutely nothing redeeming about it, and if you're looking for the main reason people skip Yakuza 3, here he is. I actually found this fight so infuriating that mid-boss battle I checked the options to turn it down to easy, which isn't possible in the remastered game, so that's cool. I feel like this fight sucks so much that it's better to let it speak for itself, so here's a quick comparison between a good early game boss fight, Vort in Dark Souls 3, and the terrible early game boss fight that is Tamashiro. Before I move on, I feel the need to mention that the Tamashiro fight took me 7 minutes and 32 seconds to finish compared to Vort, which clocked in at a cool minute and 7 seconds. Alright, moving on, and I'm gonna move directly into saying that the combat gets better very shortly after the Tamashiro fight. This is all because of a single ability that, based on the XP it takes to level up, you'll probably get in the chapter right after him, Double Finishing Blow. This completely opens the combat up. The blocking issue becomes far less of an issue because your moves that can break blocks now have a follow-up, and the crazy amount of health issue is dealt with because since you're now hitting with the end of a combo string, if nothing else, you're gonna get good damage out of every hit. You're also able to start getting Komaki moves shortly after this, meaning you now have a ton of defensive counters that allow you to constantly shift combat back to being in your favor. The Komaki knockback, Komaki parry, and Tiger drop exist on a spectrum, where the knockback has the most generous timing but the least damage potential, the Tiger drop has the tightest timing but the biggest damage potential, and the parry is somewhere in between the other two. Now, rather than having to deal with the enemies attacking you and there being nothing you can really do to counter it because your quickstep kinda sucks, you can effectively deal with them and control the overall flow of combat a lot better. There's also the Komaki Daruma roll, which helps deal with the aforementioned quickstep issue. When people defend Yakuza 3's combat, it's from the point of view of having played most of the game with this version of it. While I understand why people say this, because it is definitely better once you get those upgrades, I still feel like it's important to point out just how agonizing the combat can be through the Tamashiro fight. It really is that bad. There's basically nothing redeeming about it at all until you get the upgrades to make fighting enemies tolerable. I think what makes the small but ardent group of Yakuza 3 combat defenders so passionate is where they're coming from. More than likely, they'd either played the original Yakuza 2 or Kiwami 2 before this, and there are valid arguments for how Yakuza 3's combat can be better than both of those games. For Kiwami 2, the lack of ragdolling can make you feel a little more in control, and for the original Yakuza 2, there are just more moves, so I understand the angles that they could be approaching their defensive Yakuza 3 from. That being said, I don't particularly agree with either position. Fundamentally, Yakuza 3's combat is very defense-oriented, and I don't feel like that fits the overall gameplay style of Yakuza. I enjoy it in a game like Dark Souls or Wo Long, because the appeal of those games is that you're just a little guy trying to kill a bunch of big things, but a lot of the fun in Yakuza comes from it being more of a power fantasy, which I don't think Yakuza 3's gameplay accurately reflects. Even with those upgrades, I don't feel like the combat gets any better than tolerable until you get the final combo speed upgrade, which is almost certainly not going to be until near the end of the game, if at all. Now, to Yakuza 3's credit, I do think it's actually fun once you get this upgrade. It's just a little disappointing that it has to be so late in the game that you're realistically only going to have an opportunity to fully utilize the combat system in its best form for two main bosses. Speaking of which, I'm going to talk about the fight against the final boss of Yakuza 3, so spoilers for Yakuza 3 and Yakuza Kiwami 3 from here on out. The Mine fight is extremely fun, by far the best of the three final bosses I've covered so far. As far as the mechanics of the fight, it suffers from basically none of the issues that I've had with the rest of Yakuza 3's combat. He blocks and dodges and attacks, but because he doesn't do any one thing too much, the fight stays constantly engaging. You'll be able to hit him with a combo early, and then he'll block out of it to start his own combo, which you can then Komaki knockback him out of, and then he'll dodge around you in the middle of your combo, so you cancel your combo early to prepare to counter him. It gives this fight this really nice rhythm where you're constantly balancing between offense and defense, but going between the two is so fluid that there's never any downtime in the process of fighting Mine. He has probably the deepest and most complex moveset of any boss in the game, and because of this, you never reach the point that happens sometimes in Yakuza 3's boss fights, where you feel like you're responding to the exact same move every time. The way the fight ties in with Mine's characterization is great too. For most of the game, Mine is presented as very controlled and calculating, but as you approach the end, he has these moments of hot-headedness that seem to hide below his cold demeanor. This is reflected in his fighting, as his main style is a very controlled kickboxing type of thing, but as he heats up, he starts to do these much more wild, powerful hits as his normal moves kind of fall to the wayside. It's especially noticeable when he gets to red heat, which also indicates that he's about to use a QTE move. Thankfully, the QTEs in Yakuza 3 are way more lenient than Yakuza 2, so I didn't have to deal with an insta-kill attack at the very end of the game this time. It's a great fight, and it really ends the game on a high note. Building on what I said earlier, I think Mine being your final impression of Yakuza 3 can diminish the relevance of the really, really bad opener, and make you fool yourself into thinking the combat was actually good for the whole game. That's how solid this fight is. As a final side note before I move on to the non-combat mechanics gameplay stuff, I think the second to last boss fight against Andre Richardson deserves some praise because it's the first boss fight in the series in which the boss having a weapon makes it fun rather than just an exercise in tedium. Okay, so the most obvious and immediate change from Yakuza 2 to Yakuza 3 is the new engine. With the loss of the old engine, fixed camera angles have been thrown to the wayside as well, and god, it's just so much better. This is an improvement in just about every way, from being able to see coin locker keys better, to immersion, to controlling Kiryu, almost nothing of value was lost. The loading screens between the fixed cameras are gone too, which is wonderful. You can now run, well, light jog, the player character can't run for another 6 games, all the way from the northeast corner of Kamurocho to the southwest completely seamlessly, without any annoying freezing. Naturally, pretty much every other hardware limitation from the PS2 games are gone too, so the overall experience of playing Yakuza 3 feels a lot more fluid than its precursors. Back to combat stuff, all of the weird issues that Yakuza 2's combat had are now gone. You don't have 6 heat bars anymore, you now have 1 heat bar that gets very small extensions every time you level up your soul. It takes until level 6 to get what's functionally a second heat bar, but around a similar level in heat, you'll have access to the extra attacks and heat actions, which costs more meter than if you don't do the follow-up. This does a lot to control the spamming heat actions issue that Yakuza 2 had, so now they're a part of combat but not the main focus. The animation problem, in which the enemies would be in a state of quantum superposition where they're both recoiling and attacking at the same time, is also gone. That should make for a much better gameplay experience overall, but what's weird about Yakuza 3 is that all of its issues are brand new to this game in particular. Usually, problems are caused by either overcorrecting on a previous issue, for example the very limited heat bar in Yakuza 1 being replaced by 6 in Yakuza 2, or not having a base from which to build an idea, like Yakuza 1's lack of tracking on Kiryu's attacks, but with Yakuza 3, all of the issues are like things that have existed in a perfectly fine state prior to this game. I've heard things here and there about the issues being a byproduct of Kenzan, a weapons-focused game, so when Yakuza 3 was built off of it with much less of a focus on weapons, the problems showed up. But I can't find a good source on that, so as far as I'm concerned, it's just speculation on where these problems that hadn't existed before came from. The other possibility, according to people who have played the PS3 version, is that the remastered version somehow screwed up the enemy AI. This seems a little more plausible to me, but everything I can find comparing the versions is anecdotal at best. Either way, it's clear that there's an issue with the game, and that issue will fundamentally impact your experience with Yakuza 3 until the 11th hour, with virtually no way to avoid it. Yakuza 3 has 2 types of gameplay that aren't just beating people up. The first is yet another attempt at stealth. It appears once in the entire game, and Date will just guide you through the whole thing without any trouble whatsoever. The second is a chase, which is, functional, I guess. Far better than the shooting segment in Yakuza 1, but I think they overuse it a little. There's one relatively early in the game in which you have to chase down Mac, the Revelations guy, and there's absolutely no reason for this segment to exist. It doesn't add anything at all, or introduce side content, or provide any plot revelations, it's just a thing that happens. Anyways, I'm starting to get off topic, so I think it's a good time to move on to the setting. Befitting Kiryu's new life away from the Yakuza, he's moved away from the dark, dingy streets of Kamurocho to Okinawa, a peaceful tropical island paradise. This is an absolutely massive shift in settings. They're basically polar opposites, and because of this, there's a really nice contrast created that ties in well with the story. While it still has all the staples of a Yakuza game, like wacky substories and goons on the street waiting for some chump to walk by, Okinawa is completely different in that it's extremely comfortable to exist in. Most of the sub-stories in Okinawa are focused on Kiryu being part of the community or assisting people around him, like helping out with trouble in the local market or offering advice to somebody who wants to move to Tokyo, rather than constantly bumping into scam after scam that he has to get out of using his fists, although those do still exist. The side activities are similarly peaceful, like fishing and golf, things that are more of a nice, calm way to pass time rather than something a little more intense like hitting baseballs. This even translates to the actual environment of the city. Okinawa feels so much more suited to being there during the day than at night, which is yet again the polar opposite of Kamurocho, where the atmosphere of the city is far more suited to nightlife. Speaking of Kamurocho, it's relatively unchanged from its Yakuza 2 version. This is because, presumably, most of the effort regarding it went into moving it from the PS2's engine into the PS3's engine, which was almost certainly a ton of work. It seems like they actually had to recreate the entire map again, because there are a bunch of changes to the layout of Kamurocho as a whole, like Shichifuku Street getting a little sharper of a bend and the empty lot behind the drugstore sliding over to the side a bit, but as far as accessible businesses go, it's a relatively short list of additions. You've got a karaoke place in the southeast, a weapons dealer on Pink Street, Kamiyama has moved from the lot near Public Park 3 to an office up near West Park, and a convenience store has been added on Showa Street, but that's pretty much it. A couple of places were removed though. The store to watch videos is gone, as is the slots parlor. These are pretty minor changes, all things considered, so I don't feel like they're huge losses. As far as Kamurocho as a place goes, it's also really great. Largely because of the third-person camera, the whole area is so much more immersive than it's been in the past. You're able to actually feel the crampedness of the streets and the size of these buildings all over the place, which sells the idea that this is an actual living, breathing place much better than in previous games. Along that same line though, I think it has trouble fully selling it now that the games are in HD. There's been a clear focus on increasing the crowd density, which really shows when you pop out of a cutscene on Tenkaichi Street and there's a veritable wall of NPCs sitting there preventing you from moving forward. I think the idea behind this is good, but the execution leaves a lot to be desired. In the PS2 games, they could do this technique where there are basically a bunch of NPC-shaped PNGs out in the distance, which makes it feel like the streets are full of people. But because Kamurocho is now a single contiguous place, it would be a lot harder to do that without Pokemon Scarlet and Violet levels of pop-in when you approach them. It also created a nice effect when you were in less populated areas, because the streets tended to be less long and straight than the main thoroughfares, so it really did feel like there were only a couple of people roaming around in that area. Yakuza 3's implementation says that they preferred to focus on the close-up crowd density so that they could more strongly suggest the idea of Kamurocho being a crowded place, but I feel like that makes it seem even more artificial. It probably would have been better to shift like 30% more of the NPC volume near Kiryu to low LOD background characters, which would make the idea of people being everywhere and not just in the 10 meters surrounding Kiryu far more conceivable. Okinawa doesn't suffer from this issue, largely because it just has less people in it, but it does suffer from a similar issue, goon frequency. Okinawa is a very small and relatively linear map. There are a couple of branches here and there, but for the most part you're going to have just about every point of interest if you walk from the public market to Hatsumachi, the north part of Ryukyu, along the main road. Because everything is so constrained to this single path, most of the goon spawns are concentrated here too. There are something like 5 separate places along the path that you'll have to anticipate a fight at every time you want to go from one end of Ryukyu to the other, so odds are you'll have to do 2 or 3 menial fights constantly, and it gets really tedious. Kamurocho is fine about this because it's got so many different streets, but it can make Okinawa a little grating to play after a while. On an unrelated note, one of the best things to ever be in the Yakuza series, revelations, are now a thing. They're just wacky little scenes that you can watch to unlock a heat action, and they're almost always entertaining enough on their own to seek them out as soon as possible, even without the reward. The grandma on a motor scooter, the stripper businessman, and the drunk guy are all highlights. The only one that's a little less than great is the guy getting beaten up because it's just a guy getting beaten up. Not wacky at all compared to the others. Obligatory mention of the music, Yakuza 3's soundtrack is largely the same as the previous games as far as style. A lot of distorted guitars and short loops, the occasional vocal sample, you know the drill, but the actual fidelity of the music feels higher. This could just be the nature of being a PS2 game, but with both Yakuza 1 and 2, the instruments and the music would kind of combine together to create this ugly wall of sound that made a decent chunk of the game's soundtracks unpleasant to listen to. There are still a couple of songs like that in Yakuza 3. The standouts Derogatory are Ill Treatment, Pure Malice, and Skirmish, but overall I did find the soundtrack a little more listenable. The song D2A deserves a special mention because it's a real damn weird song to be a fight track, but I think that makes it a lot more charming. To end this relatively short setting segment, I think it's worth pointing out that there aren't any significant translation issues anymore. The original release of Yakuza 3 was still calling Kazama Fuma, but in the remastered version, that's finally gone.
カップルじゃなきゃダメなんですよね。そうですよ。いや、私と兄貴はラブラブなカップルだから問題ないでしょ。おい。
Yakuza 3's story has two extremely distinct halves tied to its two locations, Okinawa and Kamurocho. These two are so distinct, in fact, that I feel like the best way to cover the game overall is by splitting the story into two, so that's what I'm gonna do. Without spoiling my view on the two halves, I'm just gonna say that I found one to be great, easily the best story in the first 3 Yakuza games, and the other to be terrible, easily the worst story in the first 3 Yakuza games. Anyways, before beginning the split properly, here's a quick summary of the opening of the game as a hook. Kiryu is now running an orphanage in Okinawa, and the Tojo clan needs to tear it down for money. Daigo, now officially the chairman of the Tojo clan, won't do it because of his respect for Kiryu, but this shield quickly falls apart when a man that looks exactly like Kazama, who died in Yakuza 1, shoots Daigo. Around the same time, he's seen shooting the patriarch of a small Yakuza family in Okinawa that Kiryu is acquainted with. Shit's starting to go down, and as per usual, Kiryu is stuck right in the middle of it. Can he protect his orphanage and the peaceful life he lives therein, or will his Yakuza past force him back into yet another life or death scenario?
殺な第一キック
We then jump back a couple years to when Kiryu and Haruka are departing Kamurocho shortly after the events of Yakuza 2. They play a quick game of bowling, say their goodbyes to all their acquaintances in the city, Kaoru goes off to America to not be a relevant part of the series, and Kiryu has one final fight with Majima on top of the Millennium Tower to convince him to watch over Daigo. Once that's all done, we skip 6 months ahead to dinner time in the orphanage, Morning Glory. Really quickly, I'm going to introduce all of the kids. Obviously there's Haruka, then you've got Nerd, Swag, Monkfish, Racist, Crybaby, this one, that one, and Taichi. Anyways, everybody is sitting down for dinner except for Izumi, also known as Crybaby, who's sitting on the beach, sad about being bullied for not having parents. Kiryu consoles her, and they head inside to have dinner with the rest of the family. This scene is extremely important to the whole Okinawa plotline as it serves as this perfect demonstration of just about everything that the orphanage represents. For starters, there's a direct parallel to Kiryu's past as an orphan, after which he grew up to join the Yakuza, so his running an orphanage to serve as a parental figure for these children directly shows that he regrets his past actions in the Yakuza and want to make sure that the kids are steered in the right direction. This is an underlying character motivation that hasn't really been shown much at all prior to here, and now it's extremely prominent because it drives pretty much all of Kiryu's actions in the series from here on out. There's been a bit of an implication of this being an element of his character, like with Kiryu abdicating the chairman position at the end of Yakuza 1, or his constant denial that he's in the Yakuza in NPC interactions, but the orphanage is by far the most important element of this. Symbolically, it's Kiryu's version of redemption, sort of in the same way as many of the other characters prior to now have been redeemed. For Ryuji, Kazama, and Nishiki, it's been sacrificing themselves for the sake of innocent people, and for Kiryu, it's giving the kids in the same situation as he used to be a better chance at life. In terms of the actual story, the scene serves to establish that Kiryu and the kids really do think of themselves as a family. An unconventional one, sure, you really only see this kind of dynamic with Mormon divorcees, but a family nonetheless. Once that minor situation is resolved, we get another 6-month time skip, and an event in which we're introduced to some Yakuza local to Ryukyu, the Ryudo family. They've been lurking near the orphanage in a truck, so Kiryu heads into town to confront them on what they think they're doing. Their captain, Rikia, decides that he's not going to take Kiryu's complaining, and so they fight. But because Rikia is clearly outclassed by Kiryu, he loses, and they head out to speak to the manager. Rikia is pretty interesting, and I think the way he's characterized does a great job at depicting the Ryudo family as well as Okinawa as a whole. He's designed to look somewhere between a clown and a low-level Yakuza grunt, but he's the second highest ranking member in the Ryudo family, which immediately makes the group look like chumps. So the first thing you're thinking about them is that they're minor villains, basically at the level of peace financed from the tutorial of Yakuza 1 or something, but as you follow Rikia to their HQ, there are all these minor scenes of the town people chatting and being friendly with him. It changes how you view Rikia and by extension the Ryudo family, because now they seem more like good guys who, despite the criminal implications of being in the Yakuza, are actually out to help people. This continues when we meet with the head of the Ryudo, Nakahara. They make a point of really quickly establishing parallels between him and Kiryu, as both of them are adoptive fathers, which implies that the Ryudo's goal of getting Kiryu to leave the orphanage is probably not going to succeed just due to the nature of human compassion. Nakahara, who we can assume to be a good person because he adopted a kid, is probably going to be able to put himself in Kiryu's shoes and understand why he won't move the orphanage, but his obligation to try and get them off the property runs counter to that, creating an interesting conflict for the Ryudo family. That conflict is shortly resolved though after Nakahara's adoptive daughter Saki gets kidnapped by her deadbeat biological mother and another local Yakuza boss, Tamashiro. Rikia enlists Kiryu's aid knowing that he's strong, and Kiryu decides to help rescue Saki. Going back to parallels with Nakahara, Kiryu saving Saki is right on the same level as Nakahara saving the orphanage from destruction, as both involve saving the other involved party's kid or kids. It's in a more literal sense with Saki compared to Kiryu's kid's endangerment of having to move to a different part of the island, but Nakahara and Kiryu are in similar situations nonetheless. Following that same line of logic, when Kiryu is eventually able to save Saki from Tamashiro, Nakahara decides that he's Kiryu's brother now and that he won't fuck with the orphanage. Also, Daigo shows up, but this whole scene is incredibly boring, so I mostly ignored it. The only particularly relevant details are that the Tamashiro family is under the Tojo banner. Remember that the Tojo needed to destroy the orphanage to get money, and Daigo was protecting them, but he had been shot before we jumped back in time 2 years. And they're planning to build a resort or a military base, later revealed to be both, but that doesn't matter much, on the site. Alright, now we can jump back to present day where Nakahara and Daigo have been shot, so Kiryu is about to head to Kamurocho to address the issues personally. Because I'm focusing on Okinawa for now though, let's just ignore that and act as if Kiryu didn't go to Kamurocho. Most of the other story content regarding Okinawa revolves around Kiryu raising a family, so I'm going to run through all of these. A couple of the scenarios, which all focus on 1 or 2 children at a time, happen before the time skip, and most of them happen after, but I didn't think it mattered too much when in the timeline they happen, as they're mostly used to demonstrate how Kiryu is raising the kids. There's like 8 of these though, so I'm just going to mention the less important ones quickly now, and then go through the more important ones in a little more detail. The missions for Shiro, also known as Nerd, and Koji, also known as This One, revolve around Shiro and another kid getting bullied at school, and the bully is the teacher's child. This kind of solves itself as the other kid's helicopter mom confronts the teacher on being a bad parent, and Kiryu doesn't have to do much. For Eri, also known as Monkfish, she steals money from Ayako, also known as That One, and Kiryu has to teach her that stealing is wrong. Speaking of Ayako, her story focuses on Ayako getting stressed out over being relied on too much by the younger kids, so Kiryu helps resolve that by getting them all to show how much they appreciate her. Izumi's plotline revolves around her adopting a dog with the help of Mikio, the third member of the Ryudo family. All of these, and by extension all of the others that I have yet to cover, are entirely focused on Kiryu trying to get them to be compassionate people, again showing that his main goal is to keep them away from ending up in a position where they feel like the world wronged them, so it would be right for them to wrong the world back. That leaves 3 that are more significant: Mitsuo and Riona, Haruka, and Taichi. Starting with the first one, there's a lot of commentary on race that I think is pretty interesting. Mitsuo, also known as Swag, has a crush on Riona, and even with Kiryu setting him up with some of the most impeccable drip on the planet, she isn't interested because, quote, she just can't see herself dating a black guy. Kiryu is disappointed in her for thinking that way, so he heads into town where he sees Riona, also known as Racist, getting picked on for a giant burn on her arm. Mitsuo jumps in to defend her, and we're all good. Riona's burn, and the way the other kids react to it with nothing short of disgust, is used to create this hyperbolic version of what she did to Mitsuo. It wasn't in Riona's control that she got a giant burn on her arm, much like Mitsuo couldn't control that his father wasn't ethnically Japanese, so the other kids seeing the burn as an indictment of Riona as a person is more or less equal to her judging Mitsuo by the color of his skin, and not the fact that he has the coolest outfit on the planet. Obviously, racism is an incredibly deep subject. There have probably been a million graduate theses from a million different angles on the topic, and I'm simply not prepared to broach that subject in haha funny dame game, but I think this is a pretty nice, simple way of saying, don't judge people by the color of their skin. Then there's Haruka. This is by far the most interesting, as one would expect from it focusing on Haruka. She starts doing under-the-table work for extra money because she's concerned about the orphanage's finances, but what she doesn't realize is that she's basically being a mule for a fake credit card scheme. Kiryu resolves this, and ultimately the financial issues were the Ryudo family being eaten out of their office by Mikio, and it was all just a misunderstanding. Rather than having a larger theme or commentary, what makes this one interesting is the parallels between Haruka and Kiryu. We already know that Kiryu is a good person, as evidenced by the other 6 stories we did before this one, but he fell into a life of crime eventually, and now we're seeing Haruka almost go down that same road because she wants to help out the orphanage. This is kind of a common pattern of behavior for Haruka, as we can see with things like her choosing to go back to Sunflower Orphanage while Kiryu fights the entire country of South Korea in Yakuza 2, but this is the most direct parallel that there's been so far. In later games, this will become even more obvious, but the precedent for it is really brought to the forefront here, so I felt the need to draw attention to it. The last of the 3 is Taichi, which is mainly important because it shows us just how powerful he is. If it weren't for Kiryu being a good parental figure, Taichi could destroy the whole planet in a single kick. Eventually, during a Kamurocho-related errand in a strip club, Taichi walks in, he's cool like that, and tells Kiryu that Morning Glory is being destroyed by Tamashiro and his goons. Rikiya has been shot in the leg, Mikio is in a coma after taking multiple sledgehammer hits to the back in an effort to protect the doghouse, and Nakahara's been kidnapped by Tamashiro because he owns the land that Morning Glory is on. The children are all devastated, and Kiryu won't let this shit stand, so he heads off to a final confrontation with Tamashiro. Unbeknownst to him, Saki and Rikiya follow Kiryu to the bullfighting ring. Nakahara has been thrown into the pit with a bunch of bulls, and Tamashiro is waving a gun around, preparing to make the bulls charge. Kiryu jumps in, he and Nakahara manage to hold off the bulls and defeat Tamashiro, and it seems like everything's good. A house can be rebuilt at the very least, and nobody who's been hurt is gonna die, so they'll make it work. Kiryu and Nakahara made a crucial mistake though. They left the villain near a gun. Tamashiro shoots at Kiryu, and he hits Rikiya. Another character that I haven't mentioned because he's mainly a Kamurocho fixture takes out Tamashiro before he can get another shot off, but it's too late for Rikiya. He's bleeding out and fast. Kiryu desperately pleads for Rikiya to not die, not wanting to experience what happened to Yumi all over again, but there's nothing Kiryu can do to save him. Rikiya uses his dying breaths to tell Kiryu that it was worth it as long as his friend could keep on living, and then he's gone. It's an incredibly sad scene, performed absolutely amazingly by the actors, and a tragic end to the Okinawa plotline.
すみません。
リキヤ。おいリキヤ。おいお前何勝手に死んでんだよ。おい俺許さねえぞ。おいリキヤ。しろリキヤ。
If it isn't already obvious, this is the good half of the story. Even in the context of the entire series up to the present day, I would go as far as to say that the Okinawa half of Yakuza 3 is a top 5 story. You've got social commentary on criminality and redemption, as even a seemingly good guy like Rikiya is killed because he's involved in Yakuza business, and Kiryu is still being punished for his history as a Yakuza. You've got really rich, deep character building for Kiryu and Haruka that goes into detail on how Kiryu's desire to redeem his past informs his present actions, and Haruka's behavior taking after Kiryu has her falling down all of the same traps that Kiryu did in the past. You've got Taichi. There's so much here to appreciate. It's absolutely loaded with different elements that have so many things to say, and it's a pretty solid crime drama too. My only complaint is that the way the parenting segments are woven into the story is often very janky. Like, we're supposed to head to Kamurocho at one point in the story, but we have to do something like 3 separate parenting situations between the I need to go to Kamurocho and the I am now on the plane to Kamurocho. Still, even with that, these events are so important to building up you, the player's appreciation for Morning Glory, which makes the end of the scenario all the more impactful. Okinawa is absolutely amazing, and the strength of this half of the story alone is why I was able to look back so fondly at Yakuza 3. I can't say the same about Kamurocho. Actually, not even close. It's basically the opposite of Okinawa, and that's the whole reason I broke the two up. So here's how Kamurocho goes. We head to Kamurocho to meet with Kashiwagi, who's basically leading the Tojo clan while Daigo is sick with Bullet. He gets gunned down by a minigun on a helicopter and dies, which isn't great, so Kiryu meets up with Date to figure out who did this. There are only 5 Tojo captains at this point. Kashiwagi, probably dead, Majima, friend but also sad, and our 3 targets, all of whom we were introduced to in really great cutscenes on the flight to Kamurocho. The first is Kanda, an angry fat guy who now runs the Nishikiyama family after the MILF hunter got killed in the last game.
Yosha! Ora!
Then there's Mine, a new money type of guy who's providing most of the Tojo clan and Nishikiyama family's funding.
キャンセルだ。本家からの呼び出しだ。行かないわけにはいかない。
The third, and most suspicious, is Hamazaki, a real weird-looking guy with a suspiciously small roster of people in his family. Date suspects that he's working with the Chinese mafia from Yakuza 1. Our goal in the Kamurocho plot is to figure out what's going on and who killed Kashiwagi. Our first target is Kanda, and also Riki is here now. We sneak into Kanda's hotel, fuck him, and then he reveals that he's an idiot, so it probably wasn't him who killed Kashiwagi. That's that whole plot beat done, so next we hit up Majima to figure out what's going on by fighting him in the Purgatory Coliseum, just like the last game. While we're down there, Lau Ka Long invades and kidnaps Rikia, so we go and get him back, and the guy who looks just like Kazama kills Lau Ka Long. Kiryu and Rikia return to Purgatory to go over what's what with Date the Florist and Majima, and then Mine shows up. Mine brings with him 3 things. First, news that Hamazaki's probably sleeping with the fishes for letting Lau Ka Long die. Second, information that he didn't kill Kashiwagi, meaning it was probably Hamazaki, and thus that problem has now been solved. And third, Kanda's head in a box. So, yeah, that's our business in Kamurocho dealt with, more or less. There are still issues, like the fact that Mine is kind of the only person running the Tojo clan and he seems willing to destroy Morning Glory for the money it could bring in, and the mystery of who the Kazama lookalike is, but that's for Chapter 9, The Plot. This is the clunkiest piece of writing in the entire Yakuza series, bar none. What this chapter does is explain the entire plot of the game all at once in one comically long scene, nearly half an hour long in fact, in which virtually nothing happens other than the entire plot being explained all at once. So I'm going to take it upon myself to write a far shorter version of what's explained in this scene. The resort/military base plan that's going to be built on Kiryu's orphanage is actually a fake plan to root out a corrupt branch of the United States CIA called Black Monday, run in part by this guy. The Kazama lookalike is actually his brother, Joji Kazama, and he's a CIA member assisting with getting rid of Black Monday. Mine, being the de facto head of the Tojo with Daigo and Kashiwagi indisposed, is working with Black Monday to push a bill through the government because the construction plan would save the Tojo clan. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. This did not need a half hour of cutscenes to be explained. We head back to Okinawa to confront Joji Kazama before he can kill Mr. Plot's assistant in the strip club, and when we do so, he's willing to help us out. This is first shown when he kills Tamashiro, and then later shown when he gets Kiryu and Haruka a plane to Kamurocho to catch up to Mine and Black Monday before they can kill Daigo. We beat Andre Richardson, and then Mine, and then Andre Richardson shows up to make sure that his plan doesn't fail, and then Daigo wakes up from his coma and immediately starts shooting motherfuckers.
What?
Mine sacrifices himself to save Daigo now that Daigo is alive again by falling off of a roof while holding Andre Richardson, and the situation is now resolved. Kiryu and Haruka are set to leave Kamurocho one last time, but Hamazaki shows up and stabs Kiryu. As he bleeds out on the pavement, we fade to black and cut to the credits. Nah, he's actually fine. Post-credit scene and shit. This is the exact same thing as Yakuza 2's credit sequence, by the way. Anyways, the orphanage is rebuilt, Kiryu, Mikio, Nakahara, and the kids are all fine, and we're back to a nice, peaceful life in Okinawa. I think the fact that I have absolutely nothing positive or interesting to say other than rote plot synopsis about this side of the story shows just how bad it is compared to Okinawa. What it feels like to me is that the story they really wanted to write was Okinawa, but they felt obligated to write a more traditional Yakuza story alongside it because it would be such a deviation from what the games previously were to randomly shift to Dad Simulator 2009. Because it feels more like an obligation rather than something that the writing team was passionate about, the Kamurocho side of the story just sucks. If it weren't for the goofy-ass lines,
Beautiful eyes.
there really wouldn't be anything at all to make this story memorable. Actually, I should say almost anything, because there is one single part of it that's absolutely incredible. Much like the gameplay, it's Mine. He's an extremely interesting character. For the most part, he seems straight out of American Psycho, incredibly controlled and calm at first glance, but then he'll order the killing of Kondo without any hesitation, or stab his subordinate through the hand with a steak knife. There's a whole other layer to Mine though, Daigo. For some reason, Mine is absolutely obsessed with Daigo. Before Kashiwagi is killed, Mine wants to have Kiryu fill in as the Tojo chairman because he was the guy who appointed Daigo. When he stabs his subordinate with the steak knife, it's because the guy was talking shit about Daigo. Even when he's trying to kill Daigo, it's because he thinks saving the Tojo clan is what Daigo would want, and this is the best way to go about that. Mine says that this is because Daigo is just that inspiring of a leader figure, but it's interesting that, good leader figure or not, he was able to penetrate Mine's psyche to such an extent that the guy is virtually living for Daigo at this point. I've seen some perspectives saying this is Mine being gay and attracted to Daigo, and I certainly think that's possible, but not 100% confirmed. My opinion is that it's really up to how you interpret the text. Continuing on from that, Mine also explains that part of the reason he's so drawn to Daigo is that Daigo doesn't seem to be drawn to money. Growing up, Mine was ostracized for being poor, which made him want to have so much money that nobody could push him around, but Daigo's willingness to protect Kiryu's orphanage over giving the Tojo a consistent source of funding showed Mine that not everybody is purely driven by greed. Once we beat Mine, he gets a call from his personal assistant. Prior to this point in the game, when she's been on screen, it seems like she's constantly concerned about Mine as if she's in love with him, but in this call, all she can talk about is money.
会長、私どうしたらよいか。
お前だけだ。俺のこと。
私だけでは判断できず、もうどうしたらよいか。例のドバイの案件の株、時価の10倍での申し込みがありました。今回の話を聞いた欧米のファンドが会長とぜひミーティングをと依頼が殺到して、スケジュールが。
Stock deals, European creditors, billion-dollar business moves, fistfight on top of a hospital roof be damned. This seems to confirm Mine's biases about the world, biases that Daigo and now Kiryu have shown themselves to be above. When Daigo wakes up, Mine's need to kill him for the sake of the Tojo clan is no longer necessary, so he decides that the best way for him to show appreciation for Daigo and Kiryu, the only two people he'd ever known who didn't kowtow to the power of money, is by sacrificing himself. Compared to Nishiki and Ryuji's sacrifices, this is significantly better because it's directly in line with Mine's character. He's so flippant about everything to such an extent that he doesn't even care about the fact he'll die, but there is a good person buried under the layers of hate and anger that are buried under his stoic demeanor. Mine is an absolutely amazing character, and yet again, he manages to make a less good element of Yakuza 3 come off as good just through being as great as he is. So, final thoughts on the story. Okinawa amazing, Kamurocho terrible except for Mine who's amazing, overall mixed. On to Minigames. With a new engine, there are naturally a ton of changes across the board to minigames. This ranges from the extremely small, like Mahjong now having numbers on the tiles, to absolutely massive, like golf being actual golf and not whatever bastardization it was previously. We also have our first cut minigames of the series in the forms of slots, baccarat, and the 2 side stories from Yakuza 2. In their place, though, there are a total of 17 new and significantly updated minigames, which is absolutely massive. Here's a quick look at the non-updated and minimally updated ones before I get into the actual new and updated minigames. I think it was Canadian reggae singer Snow who once said, "The devil you know is better than the devil you don't," and over the years, I think that's where the UFO catcher is starting to settle into for me. It's never been good in any iteration of the series, but as so many other minigames fluctuate between being surprisingly fun and the worst shit of all time, it's nice to have a reliable baseline that I know I'm not going to enjoy in any instance of the series. To Yakuza 3's version of the UFO catcher's credit, it is an improvement over the last 2 games. For one, the collision of the prizes seems to actually resemble their shape, but ultimately it's still just as bad of a minigame as it always has been. I think it was Final Fantasy XIII character Snow who once said, "Another day left untilled is another day further from harvest," and in a way, that's what they did with golf in this game. Not gonna explain how. Anyways, my biggest issue with golf in Yakuza 2 was that it was actually just darts in disguise, so the fact that we're now actually playing golf is good, if nothing else. And yeah, nothing else is good. The mechanics of it are so bad, in fact, that the segment of the story in which you're required to play golf lets you infinitely take back your shots and redo them. It's mainly when you're close to the hole that it gets really bad. My suspicion is that this golf is built off of the previous game's darts golf, so the underlying systems are designed to have the ball fly a certain distance, and thus the short game took a back seat when they were designing the original. The band-aid fixes they put in this iteration of golf, specifically the addition of multiple clubs, don't do enough to materially change the minigame for the better, so getting the ball to go in the hole is an absolute pain. On the positive side, it's very boring, just like real golf, so I guess that's a good thing from a certain point of view. I think it was the weather-conditioned Snow that once said, "Weird-ass minigame," and it's correct, this is a weird-ass minigame. You control this, spaceship thing, and you have to shoot these, I don't even know, angels from Evangelion or something in their weak point. I don't really think it's all that fun. For the most part, it feels inconsistent as far as being able to actually complete the levels. I was able to go on a streak for a few enemies, and then right after, whatever I was doing became completely impossible. I don't hate Boxelios, though. It's not unfun to play, even if it's a little confusing. The completion list for it is a little scary, though. 50 levels seems like a lot to do in a very small amount of time. Oh boy, it's finally here. The best minigame in the series, karaoke. We have 6 songs here, but what's weird is that Kiryu only performs one of them, Kamurocho Lullaby. Another is performed by Haruka called I Wanna Change Myself. Both of these have the classic karaoke cutaways, but they're relatively uninteresting compared to what there is later in the series. Haruka's on a stage, Kiryu is on a stage that resembles Kamurocho, and that's pretty much all there is to say about them. That leaves 4 other karaoke songs called Summer Memories, Where Is Your Touch Gone, Saturday Night Lover, and Shooting Star, which are all performed by either hostesses or the karaoke machine with Kiryu giving interjections. This is kind of disappointing, but what's really weird is you can also do I Wanna Change Myself without Haruka, and Kiryu will still do the Haruka-based interjections, which sure is awkward. As a side note, I hate the mechanics for this version of karaoke, and it's not changing until Yakuza 6. It's really just that you don't know what speed the bar is going to go at, so sometimes you'll get a row moving like a snail going backwards on a travelator, and other times you have to be bounced up on Adderall to even think about reacting to the first note. Everything else about karaoke is great, even in this early form, but it does suck that the moment-to-moment button pressy stuff is pretty rough. I'm glad to say that the bowling minigame no longer controls terribly. It's a big step up that it's actually playable now compared to Yakuza 2's, in which everything about bowling was not good, and I'd go as far as to say bowling is now pretty decent. Not perfect, they definitely overcorrected with the power of the bowling balls because they hit the pins like they're made of foam now, but good enough to play a round or two here and there. Shogi continues to be shogi, but at the very least the tiles now have letters on them denoting what piece they are. This makes it go from almost completely unplayable for me to playable but I hardly know the rules. That's a nice change for a Guaylo like me, but it's definitely overshadowed by the much more significant addition of Challenge Shogi, a series of shogi games with unconventional board setups. I only did the first because it's extremely skewed in your favor and it feels good to win, and I did have fun. Was it fun enough for me to commit time to learning shogi? No, not even close, I have things to do, but it was enjoyable at the very least. Koi Koi is where it's at, and I'm really glad it's finally in the series. This is a game that I legitimately have a ton of fun playing. I know most of the hands pretty well, I have an idea of strategy, it's a gambling game with some skill involved, what's not to like? Similar to Mahjong, it does take a second to learn the rules and the hands, like the fact that the Rain Man is one of the lights cards but doesn't contribute to 3 lights, and if he's part of a 4 lights hand, it's a rainy 4 lights and worth slightly less than a non-Rain Man 4 lights. But when you do learn the hands, and they're way less complicated than Mahjong, Koi Koi is a really fun game. I would prefer if this had the option that lets you see what hands you're getting close to that later games have, just for the sake of accessibility for people not already familiar with Koi Koi, but considering I already know the rules, I didn't mind its absence much. Oicho Kabu is often paired with Koi Koi as they're both gambling games that use a Hanafuda deck, but compared to Koi Koi, I just don't have any fun with Oicho Kabu. I think it goes back to Baccarat, where it feels wrong that the player doesn't have much control over what's happening in the game, so it just doesn't click with my brain. To its credit, I do like it more than Baccarat because there's an element of risk versus reward in letting the dealer choose who to play against, but that's not enough to get me to properly enjoy it. I remember when I rolled some dice. And it wasn't that fun because it was slow. Maybe if the dice would roll faster, it'd be okay. But as it is now, yeah, it's not worth my time. But it's not because it's fundamentally dumb. It's just not that fun. Yeah, not my favorite. It's not uncommon for people to group billiards in with golf as far as minigames with terrible physics go, but I actually didn't have an issue with it in Yakuza 3. Maybe this is because I played against the easiest level of AI, but I was able to play the game, have fun, and not get punished too egregiously for misaiming the ball. Billiards is inoffensive. It's not the most engaging minigame out there, but it's alright. There's a small asterisk to that because for whatever reason billiards didn't work with my controller, so I had to swap to mouse and keyboard, but it was a relatively minor issue. I also had to swap to mouse and keyboard for darts, but where billiards was at least decent, darts just straight up sucks. I have absolutely no idea how to control where the darts go at all, which is a real issue when it's a minigame about controlling where the darts go. Power seems to be a factor, I guess, and then there's some kind of wind or something that gives it variance that I can't wrap my head around at all. I really hate the mouse movement it requires too. It's like a strong thrust forwards that just doesn't feel very natural because it's a screwy translation from what was previously controlled with an analog stick. Darts is absolutely terrible to play, and in the single round I did, I felt like I wasted my time. Fishing might sneakily be one of the best minigames in Yakuza 3. I really don't have anything bad to say about it. It controls pretty well, it's not overly complicated, it accurately simulates real-life fishing by having the tougher fish take way longer to reel in because of their increased strength and stamina, and it's fun to move the fish around like an idiot when you catch them. My only complaint is that there's only 6 or so fish, but considering Yakuza 3 isn't actually a game about fishing, that's not too big of a deal. The massage parlor has been updated from Yakuza 2 to actually be a minigame that has a reason to be played more than once. It now has a scoring system and a risk-reward system where you get a higher score by keeping the meter close to Kiryu's heart exploding, but if he busts, you lose early, and that at least gives the massage parlor a modicum of replayability. Also, this is the first of a number of minigames throughout the series that are designed to, let's just say, titillate you, but for some reason are oddly intense to play, so whatever they're going for with the visual content of the minigame becomes far less relevant than the gameplay aspect of it. I don't know, these are always pretty funny, so I can't complain. I like poker more than I like blackjack, baccarat, or roulette, but as far as I'm concerned, it's just another gambling game. It's one I know the rules for at least, but I don't find much enjoyment in it. Maybe if it had a Rain Man, I'd like it more, but the Four of Diamonds just doesn't have the same appeal. This is more or less a side story, but it's not attached to a sub-story, so that's nice, I guess. Instead, it's kind of a collection of 20 or so sub-stories, all of which end in an optional boss. This sounds good, but for whatever reason, the implementation is really bad. All of these missions are just really boring. The bosses have weapons more often than not, which means you're in for a really tedious fight because weapons have better blocking than unarmed combat. There's also a ton of dialogue for each of them, which is consistently predictable. You go to find them and they seem like a bad guy, then once you fight them they're actually less bad than they seemed. The storyline culminates in a boss fight against Arase from the first game, It Sucks, and he is actually a bad guy, but the amount of time and effort it takes to get to him only for a really bad fight isn't worth it. IF7 is another minigame based on fighting, but instead of generic opponents like you'd fight in the Coliseum or the Reaper missions, these are boss refights, often with something to mix them up. Also, these teach Kiryu heat actions when you win them for the first time, which is a pretty nice way to reward you for doing something that otherwise might not be worth the time. It's not my favorite minigame, but as far as combat minigames go, IF7 might be the best they've done so far. I'm not sure whether this counts as new or updated because this is clearly from the same lineage as the previous game's Hostess Club manager, but at the same time, it's completely different. Rather than managing a whole club in an extremely boring minigame, you now manage one singular hostess in an extremely boring minigame. You customize her, train her, and then go in and out of a room for like an hour and a half until the minigame ends. It's hard to understate how boring the hostess maker is, and the only reward you get is 100k. Money largely doesn't matter in Yakuza 3, so there's virtually no point in bothering with this minigame. This is also kind of a side story, but because it's attached to a sub-story, I'm going to cover that in the next segment. Let's start at the top with Straight to the Top, the sub-story attached to the Hostess Maker minigame. I found this to be extremely lacking, because there's just nothing here that justifies it being a sub-story you're going to take more time on than anything else. You've got a classic side story setup. There's a big problem with a bad guy, in this case the top hostess in the club is an asshole, and you have to work your way to the top. But then, rather than being interesting at all or having more characters, you just get to rank 1 and that's it, sub-story complete, the asshole character shows up to say, "I can't believe you've beaten me," and then everybody fucks off to Tokyo. Obviously, we're very early into the whole idea of side stories, but I still think this one's pretty disappointing, even for it only being a sub-story. There's only one other type of sub-story that really stuck out to me as bad, and that's the return of the Hell minigames, sub-stories that take a minigame and require you to do the hardest possible thing in them to succeed. I hate these, but I took some solace in the sub-story Seabream Strongarm having an alternative solution. Rather than having to catch a tuna, the hardest fish in the fishing minigame, you could just pay 300k to deal with it instead, and it's not like money matters in these early Yakuza games, so as far as I'm concerned, it's a worthwhile convenience fee. Outside of those, I found most of the sub-stories to be pretty enjoyable. They're just generally longer and better written than most of the previous games, so they were a lot more bearable to do. There's absolutely still massive bloat, 120 sub-stories is far too many, but the good ones are now really good. Starting with some that I found particularly funny, the Let's Learn English questline can be really great with a bunch of stupid lines, like Kiryu can say "Hey sweet cheeks" to an injured woman, or "I love English" when she's hitting on him later. It does ultimately end in a scam that Kiryu stops by punching people, but there are some solid jokes in there. Speaking of which, Mikio's Munchathon is a single big joke, and I think it's the funniest sub-story in the game. Mikio asks Kiryu to assist him in patrolling the market for trouble, but instead you just have to slowly, very, very slowly, extremely slowly, follow Mikio around as he eats snacks. It's a solid bit, and it goes on for just long enough that it doesn't become tedious, so I really liked this sub-story. Another sub-story focusing on Mikio, called Two Fathers, is also great and shows another big step up in terms of sub-stories focused on deepening character development. Mikio's father doesn't want him to be in the Yakuza anymore, so he tries to get Mikio to move back home, but Mikio's connection to Nakahara and Rikiya makes him not want to do that. I don't think this is the deepest sub-story in the world, but I like how it builds the idea that the Ryudo family are actual good people who like being around each other, and giving Mikio a little more to do than just being Rikiya's sidekick is great. Rikiya gets 2 of these character development sub-stories called Dotting the I and Hometown Girl. In Dotting the I, Rikiya and Kiryu get the tattoo artist that did Kiryu's back to fill in Rikiya's viper's eye, but the tattoo artist won't do it because he doesn't believe in Rikiya's character. When Kiryu and Rikiya get into a scuffle outside the establishment because Rikiya wanted to defend some people, the tattoo guy decides to fill in the eye because he sees that Rikiya is a person who's happy to protect others, and the viper acts as a symbol of Okinawa for Rikiya to protect. There have been tattoo plotlines in both of the previous 2 games focused on Kiryu and Ryuji's respective dragons, but they were inserted into the main story in a pretty clunky way, so I didn't really mention them. From an organizational perspective, they're much better as sub-stories, so I like that. However, this tattoo subplot, compared to previous ones, is much more focused on showing Rikiya's character to sell the metaphor of the tattoo, rather than telling you what the tattoo means to explain the character of the characters, and I think it's important that you have a deeper appreciation for Rikiya before he dies in the main story. If Dotting the I were included as part of the main story, rather than being something optional you can do while you're in Kamurocho with Rikiya, it would have made his death all the more impactful. The other sub-story focusing on Rikiya in Kamurocho isn't all that different from Dotting the I, as it's focused on Rikiya protecting somebody who used to live in Okinawa with him. It's kind of the same thing, but without needing to tie it back in with the tattoo, so I think it's also pretty solid. Date also gets one of these, focusing on him trying to win over the bartender in New Serena. Much like the others, it's very good. It focuses on Date's past struggles as a detective, ultimately resulting in the death of one of his subordinates, the bartender's late husband, and his goal of redemption for his past flaws by dealing with the criminal that killed the guy. Date has always been written as somewhat of a flawed character. In Yakuza 1, he was a deadbeat dad, for example, not to mention the fact that Haruka got kidnapped 2 or 3 times on his watch, but he's trying to improve himself now. This is very similar to Kiryu, but from a slightly different angle. Kiryu's flaws are based on his past actions as a Yakuza, even if he isn't like that deep down, whereas Date's flaws are based on him as a person, so he has to find different ways of redeeming himself. Both ultimately have the same goal to deal with their baggage, but they have to go about it in 2 different ways, which is very interesting. Speaking of redemption, RGG has somewhat redeemed themselves for the really bad trans sub-story in Yakuza 1 with Yakuza 3's sub-story Talking About Me. Kiryu chats with a trans person in a bar, and rather than acting disgusted at her existence, he just listens to her talk about her lived experience and how it affects her personal life. There's a decent joke in Yuya trying to tell Kiryu that the person she wants to get with is Kiryu, but she's beating around the bush on telling him because he's trans, and then ultimately it's some other guy who doesn't matter at all. It's a pretty funny conclusion. There's a minor caveat to this redemption in that there are a few sub-stories in the original PS3 version focusing on a character called Michiru that are closer to doubling down on the trans hate, but credit where it's due, they were removed for the remastered version. On a slightly lighter topic, the Akimoto and Mizuki sub-story questline comes to a conclusion here in the sub-stories Early Honeymoon and They Never Learn. The first is the same as Yakuza 1 and 2's. Akimoto is about to end his shit, Kiryu and Haruka struggle to talk him down, and Mizuki comes up with a crazy lie just before he does it. In this case that they're long-lost siblings, so nothing is too interesting there. The really good one is They Never Learn, where it seems like Akimoto actually did it. He jumped off the Millennium Tower, and when Mizuki gets up there, all that's left are Akimoto's shoes and his last words. Then Akimoto comes up to the roof because he was actually just getting different shoes so that the ones he leaves aren't stinky. Mizuki almost kills Akimoto, and then the tension of the situation makes them honestly confess to each other and decide to start their relationship over. It's just a nice plotline, and I was glad to see it reach a happy ending after 3 games of the same thing. That's the last of the really big sub-stories, so here are a couple more minor ones that I wanted to mention for various reasons. Silver Screen Dragon is fun because you have to do the fight in a certain way. I managed to pull this off, but I flubbed one line and didn't get the successful marker in the completion list. The 7 Mysteries of Ryukyu questline contains a bunch of minor situations around Ryukyu, but they give the city a ton of character as a result. I think the one that focuses on trying to figure out what the hell the Okinawan words mean is the best, but they're all really enjoyable. Kamurocho also gets a really solid world-building sub-story called Ghosts from the Past, in which we get a glimpse into how Kiryu's Yakuza past ruined the life of somebody. In this case, the owner of Peace Finance, the tutorial enemy from Yakuza 1, and his family, which helps build up the idea that Kiryu is a person who needs to seek redemption by showing real consequences of his actions. My overall opinion on Yakuza 3's sub-stories is, I think, positive. That being said, there are some caveats to that. The 2 Yakuza games I've played most recently were Yakuza 2 and Yakuza Kiwami 3, so that'll naturally color my perspective. From the Yakuza 2 side, most of those sub-stories were ass, to such an extent that most of the best ones in that games are beaten out by some of the sub-stories that are only slightly above average in Yakuza 3. In Kiwami 3's case, it's impossible not to notice how many really good sub-stories were cut from that game, which inherently gives me a better impression of the original game by virtue of actually having them exist. That's for another day though. I just feel the need to mention that I have my biases, and in this case they're favorable for Yakuza 3. Anyways, my final thoughts are that while the list of sub-stories is still extremely bloated, the overall quality of them is slowly but surely climbing with every game, and at this point I think it's worth at least doing the ones marked on the map. I didn't like Yakuza 3 quite as much as when I first played it, but at the same time I still had a lot of fun for most of the game. The combat is tedious, there's no getting around that, but even then it does manage to do some things well towards the end. The story, on the other hand, is simultaneously one of the best in the series and one of the worst in the series, which really has me torn. The side of me that tries to see the good in things wants Okinawa and Mine to shine through, but my natural proclivity towards being a whiny bitch says that Kamurocho existing nullifies all of the good that could have been there. Ultimately, it feels like a question of how games should be structured in general. How much do you have to do to make a game feel like a complete experience, and how much makes it go from being complete to being bloated? Yakuza 3, and many of the games that'll come later in the series, rides the line between the two, and I think what you get out of Yakuza 3 is entirely based off of what you're willing to put into it. Whether you play it expecting Blockuza and beautiful eyes, or Dad Simulator 2009 and an extremely compelling villain, you'll experience exactly what you think you will.